A very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang's Within the Frame. Coming to you live from Seoul, I'm Han Da-eun. Delegations from 48 African nations are set to attend the South Korea-Africa Summit tomorrow, which will mark the largest global gathering under the Yoon administration. Economic cooperation between the two regions will be a key focus, alongside discussions on how to jointly address severe humanitarian crises in Africa. On the eve of the historic summit, we examined the current crises in Africa, global efforts to aid the most vulnerable groups, and ways to enhance South Korea's assistance. Joining us in the studio is Peter Musoko, Country Director for the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the World Food Program. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
I understand that it's your first visit to South Korea. I want to start by asking you the purpose of your visit.
Well, I'm here firstly to thank the people of South Korea and for the action that they do to support the work of the World Food Program. This is very important. I hope that during my stay here, I'll be able to strengthen the ties with government, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Agriculture, and COICA, and other private sector donors, so that this work can continue.
So you're here to show your appreciation to South Korea's assistance, as well as to expand and deepen ties with the Korean government across various sectors. Now, for over 20 years, you've served as a director at the United Nations World Food Program. And I want to ask you about the grave humanitarian situation in Southern Africa, a region that suffered extreme drought earlier this year. Countries like Zambia and Zimbabwe declared a national emergency, and experts are warning that the situation risks spiraling into an unimaginable humanitarian situation. Can you tell us more, and what are your biggest concerns?
Southern Africa suffers from this unfortunate climate recurring condition called El Nino. What this does is it brings about extreme drought in some places, and in others, floods. And this year, the peak occurred in the first quarter of 2024. And unfortunately, at a period during the agricultural calendar, which has brought a lot of loss in the production, and not only in the agricultural production, but also in livestock. And this is in a place where 70% of the local populations are subsistence farmers. In some countries, those that are most heavily hit, such as Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, and Mozambique, these losses are estimated to be between 40 to 80% of their capacity.
The extreme drought, as you mentioned, is known to have been caused by the El Nino weather phenomenon, which calls for urgent attention not only on hunger and food crises, but also on the impact of climate change, as you pointed out, on the African continent. It looks like immediate funding and much more funding is now more imperative than ever for those affected countries in Southern Africa. Now, zooming in on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the country's conflict-driven hunger crisis is worsening as violence is only escalating in the region, forcing families to flee their homes. And according to the World Food Program, nearly 1 million people have been displaced, forced to flee their homes since the start of the year. How severe is the food crisis in the DRC?
Unfortunately, the figure you quote is just one other of the infamous statistics that come with the DRC. The Democratic Republic of Congo is, by sheer numbers, one of the worst cases in Africa. 23.4 million people are said to, between January and June, would be going through what we call severe hunger.
23 million now going through severe hunger.
That is correct. Now, this is a place where conflict, climate, and disease have come together in a wicked cocktail to bring about food insecurity. the agricultural sector obviously has taken the largest impact of this.
So you said that 23 million are now suffering severe hunger. I'm not sure if this statistics is correct, but the United Nations says that 1 Congolese out of 4 people are now faced with hunger and malnutrition, with situations particularly alarming in the eastern DRC, which makes our next question all the more crucial. Director Musoko, what efforts are being made by the World Food Program to tackle the food crisis in the DRC as well as the broader Southern Africa?
Yeah, the crisis in the DRC is an interlinked one where we're seeing hunger and protection issues and nutrition all coming together. In the World Food Program in DRC, we are targeting 4.1 million of these most vulnerable people. And I can tell you that between the start of the year and to date, we have managed to assist at least 1.7 million people who, of the most vulnerable, we have assisted. Our ambition objective is to work with other partners to coordinate our efforts to reduce these undesirable effects on these affected populations.
Reports indicate that a couple of factors like funding crunch as well as security for aid workers in the DRC are hampering World Food Program's efforts to resolve the food crisis. And this while the number of displaced locals are rising at a rapid pace. So this really seems like that now is really the time for the international community to come together to resolve this crisis, because thousands of lives are at stake, right, including children's lives. And South Korea should not be an exception in this. How is South Korea contributing to address the food crisis in the DRC through the World Food Program? Could you give us specific examples?
Yes. I mean, South Korea has been outstanding in its rapid response. Last year, when we declared what we call a corporate scale-up, which is the highest level of attention we can give to a crisis, South Korea was one of our very first donors to respond. What this does is gives us the flexibility to be able to act. Obviously, when in our line of work, how quickly you react can make the difference. And I could tell you another example. A couple of years back, we had an unfortunate volcanic eruption which threatened thousands of lives. 400,000 people had to be moved out of the city of Goma. Then again, South Korea was one of our very first donors to respond.
So speed is an important element when it comes to international aid, right? And I'm not sure if you've heard about this, but South Korea is known for its pali-pali. It translates into quickly, quickly. We're very known for our speed when we handle things. And marking the 60th anniversary since forming diplomatic relations with the DRC, South Korea initiated various official development assistance through the Korea International Cooperation Agency, better known as KOICA,
Yes.
last year. Tell us about some of those assistance projects and about the progress made thus far.
Well, first of all, again, I would like to congratulate the government of South Korea for having taken this initiative. This time, this year, for the very first time, WFP DRC was a beneficiary. We, along with UNICEF, have been awarded a multi-year donation to work on nutrition, which, as I mentioned earlier on during this discussion, is an issue along with the food insecurity. This multi-year funding goes between 2022 and 2026.
COICA has been actively engaged in providing assistance to the DRC as well as other parts of Africa as well, stretching from various areas including healthcare and education to humanitarian assistance as well. And this by sharing Korea's own development experiences. Hopefully those efforts will continue to bear fruit going forward. What is the significance of South Korea's assistance to the DRC and other African nations, and what additional roles can South Korea play moving forward?
Yes, this is very important because South Korea has stepped up to the challenges that the world faces today. As you may know, recently they doubled their contributions in terms of the rice that they give to the donor recipient countries. This year, that has been moved up to 100,000 metric tons. Two countries in the region that I come from, Mozambique and Madagascar, have benefited from this. And this is very important. I would let you know, what they have received would go to feed almost 1 million people in these countries.
So it'll be helpful for 1 million. It can feed up to 1 million people. That is some very good news on the horizon. And staying with South Korea's Africa aid, the country has set this year's budget for official development assistance, better known as ODA, at a record high of 6.3 trillion won. That's about $4.7 billion, and nearly 20% of the amount will be used to assist African nations. And South Korean Prime Minister Han Da-eun has emphasized that the need to focus not only on expanding the amount, but also on enhancing the quality of assistance. How can we make the best use of the budget?
Good question. I think that where I see the convergence is in the fact that WFP can actually help to get the government's objectives. Why do I say that? Our mandate makes us work in the humanitarian concept, but we also work in the development phase. That means we try to save lives. At the same time, we try to change those lives so that they can be more resilient in their own accord. Now, if we put those together, the humanitarian, the development, and the peace-building factor of our work, I think we would be a key catalyst to attaining the South Korean government's objectives.
The highly anticipated South Korea-Africa Summit will be held tomorrow. What are your hopes and expectations?
I have big hopes for this, and I think it's very timely and opportune to have a country like South Korea host an Africa Summit. Why do I say this? Not so long ago, South Korea was itself a recipient country. And you have made a dramatic change coming from a recipient country to a donor country in such a short duration. I believe that if African countries have a country they could learn from, it would be South Korea, because the experiences are similar and the expertise is here that can help them make that same transition.
So your hopes are high that South Korea will share its own experience from turning into a once donor recipient country to offering donations and assisting various countries in Africa in such a short span of time.
They have walked that path.
Right.
And so who better to tell anybody about something other than somebody who has lived the experience? And
right.
I think they are well placed to do that.
I
hope that this summit is an opening towards more of that kind of engagement to help African countries make that transition.
I think you've highlighted a very important point there. I heard that South Korea holds a special place for African nations because of that very reason, because South Korea has walked similar path before. So South Korea, I think, has a more competitive edge to earn Africa's trust. As you know, the competition is fierce. South Korea has to offer something more special and more enticing than its regional competitors like Japan or China, right? What more, on that note, what more needs to be done to further boost South Korea's development assistance to Africa? How can Korea cater to the specific demands of African nations' development programs?
You know, there's an adage that says, give a man a fish or teach him how to fish. I think that while South Korea has stepped up to help African countries at a time of need by giving them a fish, they are also the best placed country to come up front and teach them how to fish. Following from what we just discussed now, they have walked the walk and they have made it, and they've made it successfully. This is a time for them to also engage in teaching these countries how to fish. But let me take that further. There's also the aspect of bringing in the private sector, because for these changes to be sustainable, it has to be in itself self-generating, revenue-generating. And so I think we're bringing the expertise and the private sector together to work with their contemporaries in African countries. We could make a change that matters.
So it's important for Korea to not just offer fish and give fish to African nations, but to teach them how to catch a fish. And the private sector should play an important role in that for sustainability.
Correct.
Now, since we have a bit more time left, Director Musoko, going back to the food crisis in the DRC, what more efforts are needed, and around how much more funds are needed? Exactly how much would be needed to provide the basic necessity of the displaced?
WFP is looking at a need of about 435 million in the next 6 months to be able to meet the people that we have targeted and their needs. But I want to take you on that and say, let's look at the opportunities as well. Now, we're in Congo, where we have over 80 million hectares of arable land, and only 8% of that is actually being exploited as we speak. There is possibilities to produce much more in Congo. Of the countries affected by, the provinces affected by conflict, 3 of 26 of those provinces are in conflict. So there's opportunity elsewhere to develop structures that could, in their own light, help to feed the people most vulnerable. And this is where support from countries such as South Korea comes in, where that expertise that I talk about, that transfer of knowledge, that investment, private sector participation can play a key role in alleviating the misery of these people.
So we shouldn't just focus on the crisis itself, but we should also shed light on the opportunities that we can see, such as building agricultural infrastructure would help a great deal in resolving the food crisis, for instance. Now, what are the World Food Programme's priorities for the next few years in addressing the food crises in Africa?
Firstly, we must recognize that there is a ceiling which is increasingly being met in humanitarian funding, and we need to look at alternative sources and think differently on how we deal with this crisis. We see, I mentioned earlier on, 1 million people having been displaced, for example, in Congo in the last, since the beginning of the year, but 7.2 million in all have been displaced. Some of them have been displaced for much longer periods than a year. What we need to focus on is starting to think differently. How do we bring development and humanitarian work closer together? There is a saying by an Egyptian philosopher I like to quote, which says somewhere between what is right and what is wrong, there is a garden. And that's where I want to meet you. What we want from our donors, our donor countries, is the closing of that gap between what is humanitarian funding and development funding, so we can start making that transition right up front.
And along with the World Food Program, we'll certainly look forward to Korea's long-term commitment to help, to assist, support sustainable development in many African nations, as well as to improve the quality of life for the local populations. Thank you so much, Director Musoko, for making time for us and sharing your valuable perspectives.
감사합니다.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.